Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. I'm going to attempt the same strategy here that I did earlier. The first upload that I do will be the one that I believe is safe for YouTube. The second one that I do will go exclusively to Brighteon and Rumble because YouTube is full of censors and they are arbitrary and capricious in their censorship practices. So I begin here with the Daily Mail. CNN fires Fredo Cuomo primetime pedophile producer after he's arrested for sex crimes. He bragged about training girls as young as 7 to be sexually submissive, indictment states. Ex-CNN producer John Griffin was charged with using a facility of interstate commerce to attempt to entice minors to engage in unlawful sexual activity. The 44-year-old was arrested and indicted on Friday before being fired by CNN. Between April and June of 2020, prosecutors allege Griffin talked online with the parents of underage girls, offering them so-called sexual training at his getaway home. He said a bunch of things that I cannot read out loud here, but you can see them in the article that I'll have linked below. And just remember, this is the kind of scum who works at CNN. Remember what Jeffrey Toobin did, which I also cannot mention on a video that went out over a live stream and a conference call to other people. They merely suspended Toobin and then brought him back. You also have Don Lemon, who has been accused of sexual harassment. You have Fredo Cuomo, who was accused of sexual harassment also, as was his older brother Andrew, which forced him out of office. And there's probably an entire pile of dirtbags at CNN who are like this. They all work for the Dwarf King, Jeff Zucker, and remember that CNN is owned by AT&T. That means all of this takes place with AT&T's full approval. They are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the garbage that happens at CNN. Next, I move over to an article from Stop Critical Race Theory. Revealed woke schools now using the same grooming tactics that are used by predators to seduce kids. And you can see this multi-horned demon creature here presenting this perverted and disgusting stuff to children brought in primarily by their white mothers. It's always white women who are the ones doing this kind of stuff, just like the universities that spew out all of the left-wing trash. That is almost always a white leftist professor. It begins here, the woke nonsense that the left is imposing throughout our society is not just goofy or outright insane in some cases, it is extremely dangerous, and it is harming the youngest and most vulnerable among us, our children, who happen to be the future of our country. Most kids don't grow up thinking that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. These ideas are taught. They are programmed into children at a young age by woke parents and progressive public educators, writes Michael Austin for the Western Journal. Children are groomed into believing they themselves are transgender and that gender theory is a legitimate concept. Austin goes on to note that the tactics being utilized by the left-wing lunatics who run our public schools to indoctrinate kids into LGBTQ are also used by pedophiles to groom their young victims. He points to an August Psychology Today article by Dr. Kelly Palfy, PhD, who is an expert on male sexual abuse and a trained trauma therapist, who described how serial sexual abusers do what they do. Grooming techniques are the deliberate, carefully orchestrated acts and gestures offenders engage in. The acts are all legal and not harmful in themselves, but later recognized as offenders' preparation process, designed to win the affection, trust, and loyalty of potential victims and their parents. That appears to match perfectly with what educators around the country are doing to our children, though not without pushback from parents. They point out here that 2 of the books in question that have been distributed across America are Genderqueer, a memoir by Maya Kobabe, and Lawn Boy by Jonathan Iveson. These were disseminated to schools across the country on the recommendation of 2 prominent national school library associations, the School Library Journal and the Young Adult Library Services Association, of course, both ran by the crazed leftocracy. Both books contain various cartoon-style depictions of pornography, some of which involve children performing sex acts on one another. These 2 books were initially removed from libraries within the Fairfax County, Virginia public schools, but were then recently put back in again against the will of the parents after committees, leftist crazed committees of course, analyzed them and found nothing wrong. They've doubled down on porn in schools. They've all got to go, said Stacy Langton, Fairfax County mother who showed the school board images from the books in September in an interview on Fox News. Who's in favor of porn in the schools, she asked. I'll move down a bit further here where it points out the Thursday school board meeting is the first since FCPS reinstalled the controversial books Lawn Boy by Jonathan Iveson, which features lengthy segments of a boy thinking about explicit sexual experiences when he was just 10, and Genderqueer, a memoir, which includes photos of sexual acts between a man and a boy. So yeah, that's what's happening to your children in the school systems. So your options are you either homeschool them or you begin to take over the local school boards. Stop letting these left-wing lunatics take over and destroy everything, because that's all they do. Lie and destroy, because all they do is worship power. And from there I move over to an older article which is about population control matters, the Gates-Buffett marriage designed not to bear fruit. And what they mean by this is that both of these lunatics, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, are population control advocates. They are both Malthusians who are obsessively concerned about the so-called overpopulation of the earth. This is a very dense and in-depth article. I will have it linked below for you. But you can see here how both of them have expressed their concerns about population, and that even Warren Buffett's own biographer, Richard Lowenstein, has talked about how Buffett is a Malthusian to his core. This means that they hate humanity. They want population levels reduced the same way that Jane Goodall does, down to about 500 million. And when I talk about the leftocracy, this is exactly what it is that I'm referring to. So whenever you hear the left saying our democracy, what they mean is their leftocracy. And yes, I understand that there is a global elite that run the whole show, but right now they are primarily using the left as the vehicle for that. Yes, they've used the right in the past, but right now that is not what they're using primarily. Here I have a surprisingly good article from the far left-wing Jacobin magazine, Bill Gates' Philanthropic Giving is a Racket, by Rob Larson. Now, this guy goes on some of his own individual left-wing rants in here, but in terms of his understanding of what Bill Gates is actually up to is pretty darn good. So the article begins here. Bill Gates recently announced he's stepping down from the board of Microsoft, the trillion-dollar software colossus he co-founded to, quote, dedicate more time to philanthropic priorities, including global health and development, education, and my increasing engagement in tackling climate change. The national papers happily reported the news. In his post-Microsoft career, Mr. Gates has become better known for his work in fighting infectious diseases and climate change. In February, the Gates Foundation said it would commit an additional $100 million to fight the coronavirus, the New York Times reported. This was typical of the affectionate press treatment of Gates, who is now considered one of the better billionaires relative to Trump or the Koch brothers. This is mainly due to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the world's largest private charitable entity with billions in its endowment used for fighting AIDS, accelerating economic development, and many other worthy causes. But Bill Gates and his foundation are the perfect picture of why this model of billionaire philanthropy is so flawed. Gates Foundation was originally cooked up as a feel-good clause to cover up his shredded reputation during Microsoft's antitrust trial, putting him in the long tradition of obscenely rich people using the occasional generous gift to try justifying their enormous wealth and power. And of course, that would be like the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefellers, so on and so forth, everything that you hear pushed all the time on PBS and NPR. Because all those foundations got set up by these people, then got infiltrated and taken over from the inside by the leftocracy, and then they just direct the money wherever they want, toxifying society even further with their bad, destructive ideas. I'll move down a bit further here where it says Gates' charm also comes out in episodes in which he frequently slammed his hand into his fist while saying, "We've got to crush whatever rival dared to sell software in the 90s. We're going to put digital research out of business," James Wallace and Jim Erickson's standard history of the company recounts. Slamming his fist into the palm of his other hand, he would issue a similar vow twice more during the next year, promising to put MicroPro and Lotus out of business each time, emphasizing his promise by smashing his fist into his hand. And that's the mistake that people make. They think that because he wears these little pink sweaters and he has this soft, little goofy-looking exterior, that this guy is not internally an absolute tyrant who wants to crush and destroy any and all opposition. And really, that's what makes him doubly dangerous. And I'll move down a bit further, showing some of the powerful connections that Bill Gates has had over time. It says here, indeed, he golfed with President Bill Clinton, dined with House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and had Vice President Al Gore visit the Redmond Microsoft campus. Like all great capitalists, he enjoyed the company of powerful figures with a budding interest, but his company's aggressive steps to take over new markets like web browsing forced the Justice Department's hand. And that's, of course, not really true. They selectively enforce whatever it is they want to enforce. They were just dragging him into line is all, to get him on board with their overall goals, which he's already ideologically aligned with anyway. The ensuing trial itself was fascinating for several reasons, not the least of which is Gates' performance. He gave hours of videotape testimony for the case, viewable today online. Besides being a transparently evasive and condescending ruling class dick, Gates made a long list of claims that would soon be directly refuted in court by comparison to his own emails. The media was killing him on the nightly news, and even bland business journals like Business Week reported he argues with prosecutors over the definition of commonly used words, including we and compete. And of course, Bill Clinton did the same thing about what the meaning of is. Early rounds of his deposition show him offering obfuscatory answers and saying, "I don't recall," so many times that even the presiding judge had to laugh. Worse, many of the technology chief's denials and pleas of ignorance have been directly refuted by prosecutors with snippets of emails that Gates both sent and received. It was during this trying time that Gates discovered the wonders of charitable giving. And that is, of course, how you are manipulated and controlled, and why he gives so much money to the mainstream media. But then they prance him around on TV all the time to tell you what you should do related to COVID and the COVID vaccines. Next, I move to an older article. NIH tested AIDS drugs on foster children. This is from 2005 from NPR. Now, the media has gone into hyper cover-up mode for Fauci because Fauci is being implicated in these horrendous experiments that were done on these poor foster children. Now, the true reporting actually did take place earlier on, but they're trying to bury all that stuff now, which is why I'm going to link this below so you can check them out for yourself. Earlier this month, the Associated Press reported that researchers at the National Institutes of Health had tested AIDS drugs on hundreds of foster children in the late 1980s and 1990s. In many instances, allegedly, the drugs were given without having independent monitors assigned to the children, which is the law in most of the states where these tests were conducted. And this is a long transcript of an interview, which I'm not going to read to you here. Instead, I'll move over to this article, also from 2005 from CBS News, AIDS drugs tested on foster kids. Government-funded researchers tested AIDS drugs on hundreds of foster children over the past 2 decades, often without providing them with the basic protection afforded in federal law and required by some states. The research funded by the NIH spanned the country. It was most widespread in the 90s as foster care agencies sought treatments for their HIV-infected children that weren't yet available in the marketplace. Further down, it points out several studies that enlisted foster children reported patients suffered side effects such as rashes, vomiting, and sharp drops in infection-fighting blood cells as they tested antiretroviral drugs to suppress AIDS or other medicines to treat secondary infections. In one study, researchers reported a disturbingly higher death rate among children who took higher doses of a drug. That study was unable to determine a safe and effective dosage. And what they're not pointing out here is the kids were not given the option to refuse this treatment, even if it made them sick and killed some of them much earlier than they would have died anyway. And when they tried to refuse, they actually ran tubes into them and force-fed them as they forced these drugs on them. Mainstream media articles like this always sugarcoat these things because they can't fully admit how evil the government actually is, and people in it like Fauci. And one wonders here how many of these kids were also victims of the Factor VIII contamination crisis, which I covered in an earlier episode related to Bayer. That case, much like this one, is just evil compounded upon many other evils. It almost seems to have no end. Next, I move to an article from The Defender from children'shealthdefense.org. Guinea pig kids, Fauci's legacy of cruel experiments on kids. Recent revelations about Dr. Anthony Fauci shed new light on a 2004 BBC documentary, Guinea Pig Kids. The film exposed the cruel experiments approved by Fauci and funded by U.S. taxpayers on poor minority children as part of Fauci's search for a so-called cure for AIDS. And in one of the more disturbing aspects of this, it points out below in this article, when some parents refused to consent to the trials, children's services officials would promptly remove them and place them with foster families or in children's homes where a child's participation would then be authorized. So these kids did have these drugs forced on them. They were forcibly taken away from their parents. They were thrown away, as it says here. It is absolutely disgusting, despicable, and atrocious what Fauci has been involved in over the years. The man is an absolute demon in human skin. And that will bring me to the conclusion of the YouTube aspect of this broadcast. Next, I'll have the uploads over on Rumble and Brighteon so that I can cover the material related to Omicron, COVID, and the COVID vaccines. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.